our public education in this country from top to bottom. Number two
Do the
is
unions get in the way?
unions are definitely getting in the way, 100%. So you ain't got to argue with me on that. Our teachers union is one of the worst. So what I'm telling you is that there is a lot of pieces that are in play, but it's going to take some real radical independent leadership to be able to bulldoze some of those things. But when you talk about elections, we need to election reform. Somebody was talking about the fact that Jim Jordan can spend 15-50 million dollars on an election. No, that's not fair because he's able to utilize his seat to be able to get that money. So somebody to run against him who does not have that power, they're not able to raise that type of money because they don't have the influence that he has over those organizations already. So we need public financing of campaigns, or we need to cap how much these unions are spending in these elections. We have to do a lot of election reform on every side so that regular independent people like me can get up and knock down one of these politicians who've been corrupt for many years and bulldoze the system and not give a damn what anybody thinks.
But
That's what we
Jamal, with
want.
all due respect, that's not going to happen. The Supreme Court has ruled under Citizens United that corporations are people and have the rights to give as much money as they want. This is a whole line of cases now that goes, you are not going to be able to put into place the restraints that you're talking about on electoral spending, not with the current Supreme Court or even with the past Supreme Court, to be perfectly honest. So that's number one, not going to happen. So you have to work around that. Number two, we are not probably the system of public school education. It is funded by local property taxes in general in the country. Most people, particularly people in suburbs and living in good areas, are perfectly comfortable with that. That is an extremely difficult task to take on. I don't think it's going to happen. So once again, my view of this is you have to work with what you have and think about these things. However, to Jason, in terms of charter schools, I want to say one thing. While you think they might be fair, etc., in many cases, particularly in New York, we have many instances of this. What will happen is, yes, they take everyone, but then they make it clear that the children who are difficult or whose parents cannot help or things like that, they basically will not be able to remain in these schools. There are ways to get rid of them. So what happens is the problematic kids, the kids with major issues, the kids with learning issues who don't have parents who can help, etc., they are left in the public schools, which is why it's sort of not quite the fair system you envision. And number two, whenever you remove children from the public schools, they'll lose because we do have a system where it's per student. What will happen is certain fixed costs in the public schools never can go down. You can't, certain the maintenance costs, things like that, the principals, stuff like that will not go down. So really what happens is there is a squeeze and a drain on the public schools that are left. Thank you.
I do want to add something to Tira's point, to how charter schools are. I mean, let's be honest, right? Charter schools, in terms of performance, they aren't something that are going to benefit the typical kid who enters the classroom, right? And the charter school is also one where they can, at their discretion, as Tira said, can say, yep, you know what, you're not up to our standards for whatever that reason may be. It could be legitimate or complete bullshit, but you see this happen where a charter school.
But Gabe, is there an incentive for charter schools to do that though? Because right now, one of the issues that we're seeing in my hometown, Louisville, Kentucky, right, one of the worst school systems in the country, and that reason is because they decided to take all these kids and intermix them into all these different schools, but even their behavior. There's so many different things that they can't focus on the problem schools or the problem students. They can only focus on, or they have to spend all this time on the entire district, all this time, all these resources. And don't you think it would be better if, maybe they did have the ability to put them off in different schools and maybe focus on those certain places?
I don't know if the answer is to put them off in different schools, but there's different programs within schools that can be done to benefit the education. And I think the other thing too is, like, a lot of schools, like to Jamal's point earlier, is like, our education system is one that is structured only for testing, right? You fill out your Scantron, and based on how you perform is how you receive benefits from the state, how you get recognition from, on the state level, the country as well. We're not, the problem with the education system too, and I want to take point to, like, the label of problem kids or whatever, because, like, I think there's a lot of things that happen, right? Whether it's, what your home situation might be, your upbringing, your socioeconomic background, like all these play into how you're going to be successful in your education. And so when you look at charter schools coming in to like say, oh, we can provide a better education than the public school, that's not necessarily true. And then if you have students who, let's say, get downgraded from a charter school, they now have to re-assimilate back into the public school system, where the charter school system might have failed them in terms of the education that they're receiving. So when they come back, they might actually be falling behind from what's there. But I think the answer isn't necessarily charter schools, because charter schools, is a siphon off of funds that could go to public education. I think what you can have is you can have tracks, right? And you see that in different schools where uh, the same opportunity is given, but you have maybe different levels into which students can be taught. But also, again, to Jamal's point, I think there needs to be a restructuring of how we teach children in this country. It shouldn't purely be based on testing, because if you know how to regurgitate the answer back, does it really mean you learned anything, or does it mean that you proved that you could take a Scantron and you could fill out the bubbles and you were able to check off the box for the school to get additional funding? But I mean, like, I understand the argument of like competition, right? But I also don't think the answer is by separating kids into a completely new school entirely, because what happens is then you also have the public school system that fails, because you then say, oh, well, there's a charter school, we made this contract with the state, we no longer need this public school. And then when the charter school fails, ultimately, like, where do those students go, right? And so I think there has to be, that would be my biggest concern there, if you're going to talk about like competitiveness or challenging.
So we
But
have
why should individual mothers whose children are at risk have to sacrifice their children on the altar of this greater notion that you're in a failing public school? Remember, St. Louis public schools were unaccredited for, I think, almost 2 decades. Why should we pay $20,000 a year per kid for a failing system, and not allow those mothers to take their children and put them in a situation where they can succeed?
But what happens? I mean, what happens if because you keep bringing up single mothers who are having to raise children on their own, and I totally get that as a scenario. But then what happens if a kid goes to a charter school because the mother says, you know what, I want to offer my child a better opportunity? What happens if that kid, based on the charter school, they say, you know what, you're not up to our standards anymore? What happens to that kid then? And then what happens to that mother that's raising
How often
that kid?
does that happen, Gabe?
How often?
Because the way you're talking about this makes it seem like every kid who comes from a lower income community where school isn't necessarily doing well is automatically deemed this evil kid who can't quite work within the system, when the point is and I think Nick was making this point of, they're incentivized to work with a student because then they get funding. So the way you're talking about it, oh, well, what happens to this kid? Well, how about this? Let's come up with a solution for the rare instances in which that happens that we can maybe fund and talk about, instead of basing the entire argument as to why we wouldn't go down this road, or at least a good chunk of the argument why we wouldn't go down this road, based on, well, one kid might not work in a school and we got to figure something out. Because right now there's one kid who's not doing.
That's what her argument is.
Right, but I never said that anyone coming from a low income. I mean, like, I'm middle class. I grew up in the Chicago area. Like, I'm not saying at all that people who come from low income areas or don't have the same means as another person in a different area of the state or city is worse off. I never said that, so I don't appreciate you putting the words in my mouth. But when it comes to this, like, you're what it sounds like you're, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to assume, but the way that you just phrased that was that, well, the failure of one or two students is totally fine, as if the grand scale of everyone else is totally fine. Are you?
Oh, wait a minute.
No, that's not at all.
We're talking about a whole educational system that is not accredited. So every child in that educational system is automatically right out the gate not weighed the same way that anybody else is. So it to the tune of $20,000 per child. So how do you fix that problem?
How do I fix? Sorry, say that again. How do I fix which problem?
$20,000 per year per child in a system that is not accredited. They are not being taught how to read or write or do arithmetic.
Why not?
And what do you mean? What, I didn't hear what
Why
you said.
aren't they? Why aren't they being taught how to
Oh,
read or write
I
arithmetic?
can't answer that question. What I can
Yeah,
tell
because the
you.
reality is that we must fix the system. We
Okay,
can't.
so
What, get rid of it?
Why should children be sacrificed on the altar of our ideology about how a school system should work? Nobody wants to put their individual kid at risk, at that risk, right? But they want to talk about this sort of overall ideology of, oh, the public school system should be this way. And
Let me tell you something.
when people are
Here's the reality.
given